Hi, everyone. Ted Wyman here with another edition of On the Rocks, where we talk about curling in Canada. And today I am joined by my good friend, Canadian press sports reporter Greg Strong, who is at the Brier in London, Ontario. And I think it's shaping up to be a pretty good one, Greg. I mean, it's in a really good market there in London. I think the ticket sales have been pretty good. You got 18 teams. You got most of the best teams in the CTRS standings. What do you think about this field and this Brier in particular, coming off of a few years of pandemic Briers?
Well, Ted, first of all, great to be on with you. And yes, great to be here in London. 18-team field looks as strong as ever. It seems like we talk about this every time there's been a Brier in the last few years. Like, wow, this field is really strong. This year's no different, of course. I think we know the 6, 7 real contenders here, but there's some really interesting teams in the mix. And Ontario's Mike McEwen. That's still seems strange to say, but Ontario's Mike McEwen makes some noise, and of course they'll have 9,000 fans here on sellout nights cheering him on. He's a real interesting team as we get into things here. Northern Ontario, of course, Darren Moulding and the Hortons and Colin Hodgson, of course, on that team. They could make some noise too. The wild card teams, what are we going to get from them? Karsten Sturmey, of course, getting some quality Brier reps here and could be in the mix come playoff time. So, plenty of interesting storylines. Julie, Gushu, Botcher. It's a stacked field once again, and in a great market too. I was down here the last time the Brier was here, over a decade ago. Jeff Stoughton over Glenn Howard in the final of that one, and this building was rocking. So I'd expect more of the same here, and certainly as we get into the final weekend, I'd expect some full houses probably.
Yeah, I think Reed Carruthers, one of the wild card skips, would remember that Brier pretty well, wouldn't he? He was the second for Jeff Stoughton. So, the thing I was thinking about is that you didn't even mention Matt Dunstone in that list of big, long players that are or teams that are going to be contenders here this week. And that's a guy I'm really watching, Greg, because he has, he's wearing a Manitoba jacket for the first time in the Brier. He's always kind of wanted that. He's a Winnipeg kid. He's got a really strong team too. BJ Neufeld, who was with Kevin Cooey previously, Ryan Harnden, who's won an Olympic gold medal with Brad Jacobs, and then he's got Colton Lott, who's a really good up and coming player like Matt Dunstone himself. And I really like that team, and I think he thinks this is his year to break through and have somebody other than Cooey, Botcher, or Gushu win the Brier. And to be honest, nobody's done that in almost 10 years. The only time a team not named one of those three guys won was when Pat Simmons took over for Cooey with Team Canada, and they won it again. So it would be interesting. I think it would be great to see someone from outside of either Alberta or Newfoundland win this thing. But, I think Dunstone really has his sights set on being that guy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it speaks to the quality of this field here, where you can go down a list of really strong skips and forget one or two. And certainly Matt Dunstone is in that mix, no doubt about it. And I feel like, previous Briers were just kind of been waiting for him to make that breakout move, and boy, he's come close a few times. He's got a really strong team this time around, and is, of course, having an excellent season. Been right around the top of the CTRS for most of it. In fact, might be number one right now. Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, you have to have him in that mix too. Really hard to peg a potential winner here. Like there are like 4 or 5 teams where it's like, oh yeah, they could totally win it. And Dunstone is right in that mix.
Yeah, it's true, but it always seems to go back to Cooey and Gushu, doesn't it? And I mean, they're both going for the record for the most wins by a skip, which would be 5. And I mean, Gushu's done it all in the last 6 years, basically. So, I mean, he's been to 1 million Briers, but he just started winning them more recently, and he hasn't stopped. And that's an interesting one. I talked to Brad, obviously, before this thing, and he always weighs in on some of the subjects of the day. And I know you and I both like to talk about the issues when we talk curling. And one of the things that's come up with a lot of people is the playoff format at the Brier. And it was the same at the Scotties. And there was a lot of grumbling about it there, too, particularly from Jennifer Jones. She just really doesn't like that seeding round on the Friday. And this is going to be the same at the Brier this year. Brad Gushu thinks it needs to be changed. Matt Dunstone said he thought it needed to be changed. Darren Moulding definitely thought it should be changed. What are your thoughts on it, Greg? I mean, it's just not. I think it's too confusing and convoluted, and it just seems to take too many steps to get to what you want, which is to declare a champion.
Yes, for sure. I think the event might be a tad long. This is my personal feeling. Like starting it on the Friday night, I think if you could start it on the Saturday anyway, that might be a little bit better. But I mean, they're in a tough spot with 18 teams. That's just a lot of curling, under this two-pool format that they've got. I agree with you. I think that seeding game, I got a hard time getting pumped up for that one. And I imagine the curlers might too. I mean, obviously they want to win and get in the best possible position ahead of weekend play, but it's just not, it doesn't really move the needle for me very much as just to watch that game. I much prefer as you get later into the week I prefer to have the games mean more. And I don't think that seeding, that seeding game doesn't do it for me.
No, and I talked to Brad Gushu. It was actually a funny story because he said last year he kind of came right off the Olympics and went into the Brier, and he said he played the round robin, and then he hadn't even looked at the playoff format. He had no idea what was coming, and then somebody said, "Well, you have to play these games tomorrow," and he was, "That's just silly." So I mean, that was his initial reaction, and I mean, look, they're always having to tweak the formats with curling. It's just the way it goes. I don't think that's ever going to change. I think it would be nice if they picked one and stuck with it. And I mean, Darren Moulding made the point that if you want to be better on the world stage, maybe we should mimic the way they do their playoffs. Now that their playoffs are a lot more harsh. It's like one and done always. There's none of these do-overs, which you get in Canada. And now they're basically giving do-over after do-over in Canada.
Right.
And he just thinks there's too much of that. So I think that, I hope that with the new high performance director coming in and David Murdoch, that he's going to listen to the curlers, maybe more than has been done in the past. And these guys can get their point across because, I don't know. I think maybe it's good for TV. It's probably good for TSN to have an extra playoff draw on Friday nights. But I don't think it's great for, deciding the champion and for the curlers themselves.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's probably a TV thing, and it'd be interesting to see the numbers, like the ratings breakdown for that seeding round, compare it to, say, the end of round robin or the start of the base playoffs, how the viewership is for that particular draw. But I agree. Like, yeah, we've covered the winter games where the format is totally different, and it's really exciting. And yeah, I can see that point too, for sure. And same at a world championship where different format, and you need to prepare the curlers for that kind of format. And you're right. It seems like every year we're discussing how Curling Canada does its national championships, and with all the tweaks over the years, I mean, relegation round, and then the wild card play-in, and now it's 3 wild card teams. I imagine there might be something different next season. I mean, let's not forget they've got the results of the high performance review. There could very well be changes coming later this year. So we'll see what happens and see what David Murdoch says too.
I do like the 18-team format, though. I mean, it is a bit much. There's no doubt, but what they really wanted was to have the very best teams in the country there, and they wanted to make sure there was still provincial and territorial representation. This is the best of both worlds. So I do like that. I mean, ideally, it would be a lot better if you had 12 teams and they all played each other. Then you wouldn't have to worry about any of these playoff formats because, you couldn't say that there was different pools that were one pool was easier than the other. Anyway, I digress on that one. I want to touch on something you wrote about this week, and that was residency, which is always coming up. And boy, has it ever gotten interesting this year in particular, because, you got Brad Gushu playing with 2 players who are not from Newfoundland and not living in Newfoundland. So they're kind of in violation of residency rules as it is, but apparently they've been given an exemption because they're Team Canada. If they had to go back to Newfoundland and play out of Newfoundland, they wouldn't be able to do this. It's really odd because, like you said before, we're seeing Mike McEwen play for Ontario. You got Jacques Gauthier from Manitoba playing for BC. You got guys all over the place, that are just going wherever. And that's the way the curlers want it. And I personally think maybe they should throw residency out the window. But what are your thoughts on what's happening here? Because sometimes it seems like Curling Canada makes up the rules as they go along, doesn't it, Greg?
Well, it's always interesting, residency. You can't beat that subject. It seems to come up every season. And with this one, yes, it was a matter of clarifying the gray area with regards to Team Canada. And as you mentioned, they have two players who don't reside in Newfoundland and Labrador. And if they had to go through provincial playdowns, which they didn't have to do, obviously, this season as the defending champions at the Brier, they would have a problem. They would have to sort that out. Um, and so it'll be interesting to see if Guju, and I'm still getting used to that pronouncer, by the way, for his last name, Guju.
I'll never get
I
it.
keep saying Guju. Guju. If Goju does not win here, and he has to go through qualifications next season, win the provincials, then that would be very interesting because as it stands now, they wouldn't be able to enter with the lineup that they currently have. So it'll be fascinating to see again this spring and into the summer. Will the high performance review results indicate that there is a change coming on that residency front? I know there's been talk, of course, of adding a second import, second birthright, whatever. There's all kinds of things they could do. We'll wait and see what happens. I imagine if I had to bet on whether there'd be a change on that front, I would bet that there will be. We have to wait and see.
Well, if you want to have the best teams, if you want to be able to compete with these great teams on the world level, I think you're going to have to relax those residency rules, continue to relax them, because these Canadian teams deserve to be able to put together the best teams possible. That's my rant of the day, Greg, but you know,
well,
you're going to have this tradition too. This Brier tradition is also very good.
I always like chiming in on it, but I do think the interest or the option of having a second import or second birthright player would allow you to have strong teams and also maintain that provincial territorial setup that is part of the rich tradition of the Brier and Scotty. So it's always a balancing act, and it's one that will continue, I'm sure.
So imagine if people were saying your name wrong for 20 years and then you finally convinced them to say it right. I mean, so it's Guju. Brad Guju is the not even the #1 seed for this thing, but the guy is the defending champion. And he won it with 3 players last year, Greg. I mean, they go into the playoffs. Mark Nichols gets sick. 3 guys, they go out there and they win it. You know, I wrote about that this week too, because honestly, like, you know, Reed Carruthers started with 3 and finished with 3 in the Manitoba Provincial Championship, and he made it to the final. They just barely lost. They were leading in the 10th end. You know, Nick Cadeen's team, Nick was injured, so they went out and they played a Grand Slam and they won it. They started and finished it. You know, there's some guys that are saying, including Brad Guju himself, that maybe there needs to be some regulation on this so that teams aren't saying this is an advantage.
Yeah, and it certainly is an advantage in some ways, but the difficulty of trying that at a national championship compared to a slam or provincials, like it's much different here in that this is a 10-day event. And the curlers I've talked to, I mean, if you're talking Friday night start and you're going all the way to Sunday night, how many draws, I don't know how many draws that would be, but 9-10 days of curling as a 3-man unit, that is a tough ask. No matter how old you are, no matter how fit you are, that's a tough one. And yes, full marks for the Guju team last year in Lethbridge, doing it on that final weekend when Mark Nichols went down with COVID. I don't know, well, Brad certainly said that would be really tough to do in this kind of setup. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of 3-man teams going forward. Certainly in a pinch, and especially if you don't have a 5th or an alternate here, that's you know, you get to play with 3, you have to play with 3, but I don't think any team's going to be banking on that. You know, it's interesting just to put a bow on Guju. You know, it's funny too. I staffed the World Championships last year and talked to Brad about the surname and people mispronouncing his name for 15, 20 years. And, you know, you can write about all the stories you want. They only move the needle so much. That story was by far the #1 most read story. Him weighing in on his surname and how people have been saying it wrong all these years. Just a little fun fact.
Well, there you go. And my top story this week was of people complaining about the playoffs.
Right.
That was at the Scotties. We're going to do it again at the Brier.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting though, the Guju build up to this so completely different from last season, where they were isolating in BC. That of course you had COVID-19 concerns. Then you've got to fly over to Beijing, again, kind of isolate, get settled in, perform there, then come all the way back, and quick breather, and then out to Lethbridge, and then win it as a 3-man. I mean, this is completely different. He doesn't have to qualify. He doesn't have to isolate, doesn't have to go across the world. And he's got a 7-week break leading in from his last competitive match into this year's Brier. So I was just chatting with him half an hour ago, and he's saying, it could take 4 or 5 games for this team to really just kind of get that competitive rust out of its system. So, interesting storyline to watch here on the opening weekend.
Man, you literally just described one of the greatest seasons in curling history, didn't you? I mean, to win a bronze medal at the Olympics, win the Brier, and then a silver medal at the World Championship. I mean, it would be great if they were all gold, but that's really something what Gush was able to do.
Yeah, 3 podiums in a really short time span, like 6-7 weeks. And then to do that, win that Brier, and again, really stacked field, and to do it 3-handed at the final weekend. Pretty impressive. So we'll see what he's got in store this week.
Also impressive, your knowledge of curling, Greg Strong, and I appreciate it very much that you're able to join me here from Budweiser Gardens in London. I bet it's going to be pretty full this week, and it should be a blast. Have a beer or 2 in the patch for me, will you?
All right, buddy. Your good vibe is missed, and we'll chat again soon. Thanks for having me on.
All right. For Greg Strong, I'm Ted Wyman. You've been watching On the Rocks on Postmedia.